February 19, 1945, the fifth wave of American Marines hit the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima. Among the landing craft, Sherman tanks rolled onto the sand, their treads grinding against the loose ash. 8 of them looked identical to every other tank from the outside. Nothing marked them as different, nothing revealed their terrible secret. But these 8 machines would account for roughly 1/3 of all Japanese casualties in the battle, and they would do it in the most horrifying way imaginable. Before we dive into what made these tanks so devastatingly effective, consider this. What transforms a weapon from merely deadly to psychologically devastating? Is it raw firepower, or something far more primal? Keep that question in mind as we explore one of World War II's most controversial innovations. The story begins not on Iwo Jima, but 5 months earlier in Hawaii. At Schofield Barracks, a secret team was assembled under Colonel George Unmarked. His mission was straightforward but daunting: create a weapon that could neutralize Japanese cave and bunker complexes that had proven immune to conventional firepower. The problem the Marines faced in the Pacific was unlike anything they'd encountered before. Japanese defensive tactics had evolved dramatically. Gone were the banzai charges and beach defenses of earlier battles. Now the enemy waited underground, dug into volcanic rock, hiding in interconnected tunnel systems that stretched for miles. Naval bombardment was useless. Artillery couldn't penetrate. Even direct hits from 16-inch naval guns left these fortifications intact. Unmarked's team included 25 men from the Navy's construction battalions, the famous Seabees, along with personnel from Marine tank battalions and Army ordnance units. Leading the technical work were 2 Seabees whose names history barely remembers: Machinist Mate First Class A. Riker and Electrician's Mate Second Class Joseph Kissel. These men had seen the problem firsthand. They'd watched Marines die by the hundreds trying to assault positions that simply wouldn't fall. They understood that the issue wasn't about hitting harder, it was about applying force in a way the enemy couldn't defend against. Previous attempts to mount flamethrowers on tanks had failed. The Canadian Ronson system, which the Marines had tried, was unreliable, failing 40% of the time in combat. Its range was limited to just 60 or 80 yards. The fuel lasted only 30 to 40 seconds. Worst of all, the light tanks that carried these systems had armor too thin to survive Japanese anti-tank guns. Riker and Kissel decided to start from scratch. Working 20-hour days in the Hawaiian heat, sleeping in shifts beside their welding equipment, they began combining the best elements from 3 different flamethrower systems: the British Ronson, the Navy Mark I, and captured German designs from North Africa. The result was designated the CBH-1, Construction Battalion Hawaii 1. Installing it required 150 pounds of welding rod and 1,100 electrical connections. Each conversion took 1,200 man-hours and cost roughly $20,000 today. But the specifications were revolutionary. The CBH-1 operated at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure, triple that of previous designs. Maximum range extended to 150 yards with thickened fuel, nearly 3 times the distance of portable flamethrowers. The fuel mixture, a carefully calibrated blend of diesel, gasoline, and napalm thickener, would burn at 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, and critically, the system could maintain continuous fire for up to 80 seconds. Here's where it gets interesting. The flamethrower completely replaced the tank's main gun, but it could traverse the full 270 degrees and elevate just like a regular cannon. The gunner could aim it through the same periscope and controls. This meant tank crews needed almost no special training, and perhaps most importantly, the Seabees painted these modified Shermans in standard Marine Corps olive drab. No special markings, no indication of their purpose. To Japanese observers, they would appear to be ordinary Sherman tanks, right up until the moment they opened fire. Think about the psychology of that for a moment. You're a Japanese defender, dug into what you believe is an impregnable position. You've survived days of bombardment. Your concrete bunker has walls 4 feet thick. You see American tanks approaching, the same tanks you've been fighting all along. And then one of them does something you've never seen before, something you weren't prepared for, something that turns your greatest strength into a death trap. While Riker and Kissel were perfecting their design in Hawaii, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was transforming Iwo Jima into the most formidable fortress in the Pacific. He'd spent an entire year preparing. 11 miles of interconnected tunnels had been carved into the volcanic rock, 5,000 caves and underground chambers, 1,500 fortified positions, 21,000 men were ready to make their last stand. Kuribayashi knew his men wouldn't survive the battle. He'd studied previous defeats at Saipan and Peleliu. He understood that Japan couldn't win, but he could make the Americans pay such a terrible price that they might reconsider invading the Japanese homeland. His orders to every soldier were clear: don't die until you've killed at least 10 Americans. For 74 consecutive days, the American Navy pounded Iwo Jima. Warships and bombers dropped 6,800 tons of bombs. 22,000 shells rained down on the island. American intelligence naively underestimated the Japanese force, believing only 4,000 troops defended the island instead of 21,000. They made an even greater mistake by assuming the bombardment had done its job. In reality, only about 200 of the 1,500 Japanese fortifications had been destroyed. The main force waited underground, virtually untouched, ready to show the Marines a kind of combat they'd never experienced before. The Marines hit the beaches on February 19th. At first, everything seemed quiet. Then all hell broke loose. By nightfall, they'd gained less than 700 yards at the cost of 2,400 casualties. But this was just the beginning. The 8 Flame Shermans landed on D-Day, mixed in with regular tanks. Navy orders specified they remain in reserve for the first 24 hours. These were precious, irreplaceable assets. Marine commanders wanted to assess the situation before committing them. For the first day and night, the flame tanks sat idle near the beach while Marines died by the hundreds. The volcanic ash, which rose to the top of a man's calf with each step, made infantry movement exhausting. Conventional tactics were failing catastrophically. Naval gunfire couldn't reach bunkers buried under 10 feet of rock and concrete. Artillery shells exploded harmlessly. Marine riflemen found themselves attacking fortifications that might as well have been solid mountains. On the morning of February 20th, D+1, the situation was desperate. The 21st Marine Regiment was pinned down trying to cross Motoyama Airfield No. 1. 3 concrete pillboxes dominated the approach. 2 rifle companies had already been decimated. The regiment had suffered 35% casualties in less than 48 hours. Lieutenant Colonel William Duplantis made the call that would change everything. He requested the flame tanks. At 2:20 in the afternoon, the first M4A3R3 flamethrower tank entered combat. Tank number 403 Fur, commanded by Staff Sergeant Robert Meza, approached the Japanese positions from an oblique angle. To the Japanese defenders, it looked like just another Sherman, attempting the same failed assault they'd repelled all day. Inside the tank, the 5-man crew prepared for action. The driver guided the 35-ton vehicle through the ash. The assistant driver manned the bow machine gun. The loader checked the fuel pressure gauges, 300 psi, optimal. The gunner tracked the nearest pillbox through his periscope. At 125 yards, Meza gave the order. The CBH-1 erupted with a sound witnesses described as the devil's own blowtorch. A stream of napalm-thickened fuel arced through the air, propelled by compressed nitrogen. The burning liquid struck the pillbox aperture with devastating accuracy, splashing through the machine gun port and flowing inside. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Temperatures inside the concrete structure soared past 1,200 degrees in seconds. The oxygen was consumed so rapidly that many Japanese soldiers suffocated before the flames reached them. Those who survived the initial blast and tried to flee through rear exits were cut down by Marine riflemen who had learned to position themselves for exactly this moment. Here's something worth considering. Flamethrowers had been used before in the Pacific. Portable flamethrowers carried by infantry had proven effective but at a terrible cost. Operators had a 94% casualty rate on Iwo Jima. They were easy targets, carrying 70 pounds of fuel on their backs, having to get within grenade range to be effective. But now, that same capability was protected by a Sherman's armor and could reach 3 times as far. Meza traversed the turret and engaged the second pillbox. A Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun fired point blank. The shell struck the Sherman's frontal armor and ricocheted skyward. The tank shuddered but continued advancing. The gunner triggered another burst, maintaining fire for 15 seconds until black smoke billowed from every opening of the fortification. The third pillbox required different tactics. Its position behind a rocky outcropping prevented direct engagement. Meza ordered his driver to advance within 80 yards. As they crested a small rise, Japanese soldiers emerged from spider holes with satchel charges and magnetic mines. This was the moment the CB's innovation proved its worth. Unlike standard flamethrower tanks that could only fire forward, the CBH-1's full traverse allowed the gunner to swing the turret 180 degrees and fire directly behind the tank. The attacking infantry were consumed by flames before they could reach their target. With 3 pillboxes neutralized, Marines of the 21st Regiment advanced 400 yards in 2 hours. More progress than they'd made in the previous 2 days combined. Word spread rapidly. The flame tanks worked. More importantly, they survived where conventional tanks failed. Within 6 hours, all 8 flame tanks were in action across the front. The tactical revolution was immediate and profound. So here's a question for you to think about. When technology changes the battlefield so dramatically, does it fundamentally alter the nature of courage? The Japanese soldiers defending Iwo Jima had been trained to die at their posts. They'd proven their willingness to do exactly that against conventional weapons. But when flame tanks appeared, something unprecedented happened. Japanese soldiers began abandoning positions rather than face incineration. Was this a failure of courage, or a rational response to a threat no amount of bravery could overcome? The answer might tell us something important about the limits of human endurance. Tank number 434, supporting the 23rd Marines near the East Boat Basin, destroyed 4 fortified positions in a single afternoon. The crew developed a technique they called corkscrew and burn, approaching in a spiral pattern to avoid anti-tank fire while maintaining continuous flame suppression. Tank number 437 pioneered what became known as breach and clear tactics. The flamethrower would neutralize a position's defenders, then Marine engineers would rush forward with demolition charges to permanently destroy the fortification. In one afternoon, a single flame tank and engineer team destroyed 7 bunkers that had stopped an entire battalion's advance, but it was tank number 432 that demonstrated the weapon's true psychological impact. Supporting the 26th Marines near Mount Suribachi, the tank approached a complex of interconnected caves. The commander stopped 100 yards from the cave entrances. Through his periscope, he could see Japanese soldiers watching from the darkness. He triggered a short burst into the air, a demonstration. The psychological effect was immediate. Japanese soldiers began fleeing from rear exits, abandoning positions they'd been ordered to defend to the death. Marine riflemen were so surprised they initially failed to fire on the retreating enemy. In 30 minutes, an entire defensive sector collapsed without the tank firing directly at a single position. This represented the first mass abandonment of defensive positions in Japanese military history. By nightfall on February 20th, Marine units were already modifying their tactics around flame tank availability. Attack plans were postponed until flame tanks could be brought forward. Infantry learned to follow 50 yards behind, close enough to exploit the shock effect but far enough to avoid the heat blast. The numbers from the first day were striking. 47 fortified positions destroyed, Marine casualties in supported sectors down 40%, 600 yards of territory gained in areas that had been static for 48 hours. But perhaps most significantly, for the first time, Japanese soldiers were surrendering rather than dying at their posts. Many specifically cited fear of burning alive as their reason. The Japanese response was swift. General Kuribayashi issued emergency orders, designating flame tanks as priority targets. Special assault teams were organized, volunteers who would attack with explosive charges strapped to their bodies. But the fundamental problem remained. The flame tanks looked identical to regular Shermans until they fired. Japanese gunners couldn't identify priority targets until it was too late. On February 23rd, the same day Marines raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, the flame tanks faced their greatest test at Hill 3A2. This was the second highest point on Iwo Jima, and the cornerstone of Kuribayashi's northern defenses. The hill was honeycombed with bunkers and tunnels reaching 7 stories underground. Previous assaults had failed with casualties exceeding 50%. 4 flame tanks advanced in formation, supported by 6 conventional Shermans and a battalion of Marine infantry. Hidden 75mm mountain guns, larger than the standard anti-tank weapons, had been positioned specifically to engage flame tanks. As the lead tank crested the first rise, concentrated fire erupted. The first round struck Tank 433's track, immobilizing it, but the crew continued firing while stationary, creating a curtain of flame that obscured following vehicles. This self-sacrifice allowed the other tanks to maneuver. Tank 434 pushed through the smoke. At 60 yards from the main bunker complex, its flamethrower erupted. But the Japanese had adapted. Engineers had installed steel plates over bunker apertures that could be closed between machine gun bursts. The flames splashed against sealed steel. The gunner made a critical observation. The steel plates glowed cherry red. After sustained contact, metal that hot would warp. He maintained fire for 45 seconds, far longer than doctrine recommended, dangerously depleting fuel reserves. The steel plate buckled. The mixture poured through the gaps. The bunker's interior became an inferno. Secondary explosions revealed tunnel entrances the Japanese had carefully concealed. In 3 hours, Hill 382's outer defenses had been breached. The impregnable position was falling, but the battle also revealed the flame tanks' limitations. They consumed fuel rapidly. Refueling required withdrawing to designated areas, a process that took 2 hours minimum. The tanks were powerful but not inexhaustible. It's also worth noting that portable flamethrowers still had a critical role. When flame tanks couldn't maneuver through narrow ravines, Marines like Corporal Herschel Woody Williams advanced on foot with 70-pound M22 flamethrowers. In 4 hours of combat, covered only by 4 riflemen, Williams destroyed 7 pillboxes inaccessible to tanks. His actions earned him the Medal of Honor. He would become the last surviving World War II Medal of Honor recipient, passing away in June 2022 at age 98. By early March, the battle shifted to Iwo Jima's northern plateau, a hellscape of sulfur pits and volcanic rock that made tank operations nearly impossible. The flame tanks adapted again, becoming mobile pillboxes positioned at key points. Marine engineers worked through the night constructing ramps, often under sniper fire, allowing tanks to reach previously inaccessible positions. On March 8, Tank 436 achieved what crews called the impossible shot. Supporting the 9th Marines' assault on Needles Pocket, a complex of caves built into a near-vertical cliff face, the tank commander calculated that flame fired at maximum elevation might arc over the cliff edge and fall into Japanese positions from above. The physics were marginal. The CBH-1 could elevate to 35 degrees, but reaching the target required 40 degrees. The commander ordered his driver to position the tank on a pile of rubble, tilting the entire vehicle backward. With enemy mortar rounds falling around them, the gunner triggered the flamethrower. The molten napalm arced high, seemed to hang for a moment at its apex, then cascaded down into Japanese positions. The effect was devastating. Japanese soldiers who'd believed their elevated positions were immune to flamethrower attack discovered they were wrong. Witnesses reported soldiers leaping from cliffs rather than burn, choosing death by falling over death by fire. The fuel logistics alone were extraordinary. Mixing stations operated 24 hours a day, combining diesel, gasoline, and napalm powder in precise ratios. The mixture had to be used within 72 hours, or it would separate and clog the flame guns. The supply chain stretched back to Pearl Harbor. The Japanese continued adapting as well. Tank killer teams armed with explosive charges achieved some success. Tank 438 was destroyed on March 11 when a soldier detonated himself against the vehicle's engine compartment, killing 3 crew members, but such tactics were ultimately futile. For every damaged tank, replacements arrived and damaged tanks were often repaired and returned to action. General Kuribayashi, observing from his command bunker deep beneath the northern plateau, recognized the strategic implications. In his final report to Imperial headquarters on March 17, he wrote that the enemy's flame tanks had proven more effective than all their artillery and aerial bombardment combined. They achieved in minutes what conventional weapons couldn't accomplish in days. Japan had no effective counter. The crescendo came during the final week of March. In the gorge, Kuribayashi's last stronghold, the remaining 3,000 Japanese defenders prepared to make their final stand. This twisted maze of ravines and caves represented the ultimate test. On March 21, D+30, all operational flame tanks concentrated for a coordinated assault. 6 of the original 8, with 2 under repair, had been reinforced by 4 additional tanks rushed from Hawaii. The assault would be the largest concentration of flame weapons in the Pacific War. The tanks advanced in a crescent formation, creating overlapping fields of flame. Marine infantry followed, throwing white phosphorus grenades to mark targets. Engineers sealed positions after flamethrowers cleared them. The Japanese resistance was fanatical but increasingly futile. By sunset, the gorge had been penetrated. Over 800 Japanese defenders lay dead. The flame tanks had consumed 8,000 gallons of fuel mixture in a single day. Marine casualties, while still significant at 92 killed and 257 wounded, were a fraction of what conventional assault would have cost. But the price of victory was becoming apparent on both sides. Tank crews reported severe psychological trauma. Corporal Carlson of Tank 431 later testified, "You could hear them screaming when the flame hit. Not for long, but you heard it. Sometimes at night I still hear it. We did what we had to do, but I'll never forget the smell." Burning flesh mixed with sulfur from the volcanic rock. Maintenance crews found human remains fused to tank tracks. The tanks themselves were deteriorating. By late March, keeping even 4 tanks operational required cannibalizing parts from damaged vehicles. On March 26, Iwo Jima was declared secure. The battle had lasted 36 days instead of the projected 5. American casualties totaled 26,038, including 6,821 killed. Japanese losses were nearly total. Of approximately 21,000 defenders, only 216 survived as prisoners. The flame tanks had revolutionized the battle's dynamics. Post-action analysis credited them with reducing American casualties by an estimated 5,000 men. They'd destroyed over 1,000 fortified positions and consumed 360,000 gallons of fuel mixture. Captain Frank Caldwell, commanding Company F, 26th Marines, provided perhaps the most succinct assessment. It was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle. Artillery, naval gunfire, and aerial bombardment could not rout the Japanese from their underground fortresses. The flamethrower tanks did what nothing else could. Statistical analysis revealed the true impact. Over 30% of Japanese casualties on Iwo Jima were caused by flame weapons. In sectors where flame tanks operated, the rate of advance increased by 300%. Japanese prisoners numbered 216, more than the combined total from Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu. Many specifically cited fear of burning alive as their reason for surrendering. The Marine Corps immediately requested 54 additional flame tanks for future operations. By June 1945, 70 new flame tanks were ready for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. During the Battle of Okinawa, Army flame tanks consumed 200,000 gallons of fuel mixture, proving equally effective against cave complexes. But what does this story ultimately teach us? The flame tanks represented something more than a new weapon. They embodied the transformation of warfare from individual courage to industrial capability. The Japanese had built what they believed was an impregnable fortress. They'd spent a year preparing. They'd followed centuries of warrior tradition. But they hadn't anticipated American technological innovation married to industrial production capacity. In 2015, the last reunion of Iwo Jima flame tank veterans was held. Only 3 crew members attended, all in their 90s. Corporal Anthony Vitelli offered perhaps the most poignant observation. "People ask if I'm proud of what we did. Pride isn't the right word. We did a terrible job that had to be done. Those tanks saved Marine lives. That's enough." The last surviving M4A3R3 flamethrower tank from Iwo Jima sits today in the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia. Tank number 434 bears the scars of its service, welding marks where armor was patched, dents from shell impacts, scratches from volcanic rock. A small plaque notes its specifications and battle history. What it cannot convey is the sound of compressed nitrogen releasing, the smell of burning napalm mixed with sulfur, the sight of liquid fire flowing into underground fortresses. Visitors often pass quickly, disturbed by the weapon's terrible purpose. Veterans who understand its history pause longer, some saluting, others simply staring in silent remembrance. The 8 flamethrower tanks of Iwo Jima have passed into history, but their legacy continues. They demonstrated that victory in modern warfare belongs to nations capable of superior innovation and production. They shortened one of the Pacific War's bloodiest battles, saving thousands of American lives. And they forced both sides to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of necessary evil in wartime. Perhaps the final word belongs to one of the Seabees who built these machines. Asked years later if he had any regrets, Joseph Kissel simply said, "We built what had to be built. We did it as well as we could, and we're glad it worked, because it meant Marines went home who otherwise wouldn't have." The flames of Iwo Jima have long since died. But the transformation they created, the revolution in how wars are fought and won, burns eternal in military history.